I remember Corbynism very vividly, and that was a horrible turn for the Labour Party. In France, I'm sure you and I probably have some disagreement on this, but I was definitely relieved to see the hard left and sort of centrists and some reasonable elements of the right come together to defeat national rally majority.
Do I give off a Le Pen vibe?
No, not at all. I just wonder if you're less sanguine than me about like the hard left gaining more power in France. That's all.
It looks like Le Pen's party has changed, from what it used to be, and
you do not give off Le Pen vibes, for the record.
Good. Welcome back to another episode of the Quillette Etc. podcast. You're with me, Zoe Booth, and today I'm talking to Matt Johnson. Matt Johnson has been contributing to Quillette for a long time. He's contributed over 31 pieces. He's also the author of How Hitchens Can Save the Left, Rediscovering Fearless Liberalism in an Age of Counter-Enlightenment, published in 2023. Matt and I have a great conversation, and it covers two main topics. The first part is about this debate of whether we're all culturally Christian in the West. You probably know that Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Tom Holland, who wrote Dominion, are out there as saying that whether we like it or not, whether we see ourselves as atheists or not, we are all culturally Christian. There's also this idea that's quite popular at the moment that we are all lacking meaning in the West because we've given up on going to church and organized religion. Matt wrote a really good piece on this, which I will link in the show notes. The second part of the conversation covers another topic that Matt's covered a number of times in Quillette, John Mearsheimer and his work on the Israel lobby. It's obviously a big topic at the moment with the current war in Gaza. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation. If you do, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and even better, become a member on Quillette. There are so many benefits of being a Quillette member. You get invited to our parties, you get to read all of our articles without a paywall, and in doing so, you're contributing to really important journalism, the likes of which Matt Johnson is doing, and you can promote important ideas and important political discussion, which is so rare right now. Quillette is politically nonpartisan, but we rely on reason, science, and humanism as our guiding values. If you're also aligned to our values, I really suggest that you become a paid subscriber. You've got a home here at Quillette in an otherwise heavily politicized and polarized world. There is rational discussion happening at Quillette. So please support us. It means a lot. But without much further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Matt Johnson. Matt, so originally I wanted you on the podcast to talk about your really interesting article on Mearsheimer and the Israel lobby. But since then, we've published another really interesting essay of yours about liberalism and the West's crisis of meaning. I'm going to try to talk about both of those topics that are sort of unrelated, but I feel like there's a sliver in the Venn diagram where they cross over slightly maybe. I want to cover both of those topics, but let's start with your most recent essay on liberalism and the West's crisis of meaning. Is the West going through a crisis of meaning?
Well, a lot of people insist that we are. And this has become a sort of obsession of mine lately. So there's this phenomenon that the journalist Ed West called the New Theists or New Theism. And it's this assertion that, even if you don't believe in the divinity of Christ, or even if you don't believe in, the Jewish God, Judeo-Christian civilization is utterly dependent upon these myths and upon this history. And if we don't recommit to it in some sense, then we'll just be batted about by the whims of postmodernism and identity politics, and we'll fill the original faiths with these surrogate faiths like political radicalism and countless other things. So there's this insistence among a growing subset of intellectuals and their followers that, without the Judeo-Christian tradition, we will be adrift in a sea of meaninglessness and pointlessness. And I've never bought this. As somebody who hasn't been a believer for a very long time, I find it easy to find sources of meaning in my life. My friends and family are quite a powerful source of meaning. The work that I do, people say, "Oh, politics is a very poor substitute for religion." That may be so, but I'm not seeking meaning in politics in the same way that they insist, I should be seeking meaning in religious faith. So yeah, it's just, I think it's kind of a category error, and it's kind of insulting to assume that the people who don't believe have absolutely no like source of meaning or purpose.
Yeah, and it seems that like these new theists, or as Adam Wakeling, another Quillette writer, wrote, or he calls them political Christians, not only do they believe that the West as we know it wouldn't be the West without Christianity or Judeo-Christian values, which I'm sure, and I think you wrote about it, you don't deny that. You deny more that we need this idea that the new theists have, that we need religion or Judeo-Christian, Christianity to have meaning. That's the part you disagree with, right? You don't necessarily disagree that we wouldn't be where we are without Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's also a corollary to that, which is that I don't think the new theists have a very fair appreciation of the history of Enlightenment thought and secular challenges to religion, and how those challenges are so fundamental to the liberal societies that we have today. So I'm more than happy to admit that, yes, the existence of a transcendental religion, Christianity primarily in Europe, played a major role in the development of the rule of law and in lots of our institutions. I think that's just historically obvious. But at the same time, they then turn around and say, well, secular humanism is just yet another product of Christianity. So it doesn't deserve credit as an isolated and independent variable in the development of these societies. And that to me is just sort of stacking the deck. I mean, you're basically just saying that every good thing we have, every moral advance we've made, is ultimately due to religious faith. So I'm willing to give them the nod and say, yes, surely Judeo-Christian thought has had a huge influence, but they don't return the favor.
And there's this argument too that I think Jordan Peterson makes, which is, well, even if you yourself don't identify as a Christian, you are a Christian because you've just been marinating in this Christian juice. Maybe that's not the right word.
No. I mean, I think that's actually, yeah. That's when it becomes insulting, frankly, because I mean, Jordan Peterson says if you don't spend your time murdering and pillaging, to your heart's content, then you aren't functionally atheist. The only real atheists are, say, Nietzsche, or say the Nazis, or say anybody who holds a set of moral beliefs that Jordan Peterson finds abhorrent. Then they can suddenly be branded with the atheist label. But anybody who actually is a humanist, anyone who's a real liberal and committed to the institutions of the liberal democratic West, is by definition Christian, according to Tom Holland and Peterson and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and a lot of these folks who would fall under the sort of new theist heading. And
I again, have to admit, I sort of, only recently started going down that route a little bit with, because I've read Dominion. People kept telling me for years, you've got to read Dominion. I read Dominion. I really enjoyed it. I, grew up in a very non-religious household. I didn't have any understanding of scripture or the Abrahamic religions. And, my parents aren't married, all of these things. And so for me, it did give me a better understanding of the Abrahamic religions and, the West. But I did come out of it feeling quite convinced that, wow, I guess I am a cultural Christian and I never knew it. Thanks for enlightening me, Tom Holland. But so it's been good to read your critique of that. Actually, it sort of pulled me back.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad it had that effect. And it just, yeah, I think it would be simplistic to say it has to be either or. But I mean, when the explicit criticism of religion was so critical to Enlightenment thought, and when you consider the fact that the Enlightenment came about in a context of religious violence and persecution and authoritarianism, I mean, the 30 Years' War, I think, knocked out something like a third of Central Europe's population. Like this was 150 years of warfare. It just seems very obvious to me that the explicit resistance to all of these horrors was a really key part of how our societies have developed. And then if you look at Thomas Jefferson and the founders and what they were saying about especially Jefferson, the importance of separating church from the state, and doing so in really specific Enlightenment language. I mean, in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, for example, Jefferson says, we're sort of powerless to resist what our reason determines is true in the world. So you can't hold somebody to account for holding views that you don't hold or holding religious beliefs that you don't hold, because it's not even their decision. You're either swayed or not swayed by these ideas and by these traditions. And this is just a very Enlightenment idea. But then I suppose Tom Holland would say, well, great, he's just a cultural Christian too. And that just seems, any argument that explains absolutely everything explains next to nothing. So, yeah, I just think they're taking liberties that they shouldn't be taking historically.
Are there many liberal countries that don't have a Christian background?
No, I mean, it really is a pretty, I mean, I suppose you could certainly say, Japan and South Korea are both liberal countries that yeah, and I think this is actually a decent argument against the claim that tradition is so fundamental to the institutions that we enjoy today, because Japan was remarkably effective at just grafting liberal ideas and institutions onto existing social and cultural structures, which shows that they're really more protean than we might have assumed. So that's one of the reasons why, yeah, just the rise of East Asia was such a historical aberration. And it also came in the wake of World War II, after we dropped 2 A-bombs on Japan. I mean, it's really one of the most extraordinary historical turnarounds that you can possibly imagine.
And I know you're a big fan of Fukuyama. Is that right?
I am.
Yeah. I actually haven't read a lot of his work. I know I really should. But I'm pretty sure he's American, but obviously he's from a Japanese background. Do you think that's, you've just talked about Japan. I'm thinking now, do you think that had something to do with his ideology and his writing on?
I don't think so. I there were elements of his personal history that I'm sure have informed how he looks at the world. I believe his grandfather was actually interned during World War II, during the insane period where he put perfectly patriotic Japanese citizens in internment camps. But that certainly hasn't diminished Fukuyama's commitment to American democracy or his acknowledgement that American democracy is really something unique and worth emulating around the world. Yeah, I mean, Fukuyama was really heavily influenced by Hegel through Alexander Kojève. I'm sure that's a terrible pronunciation, but he gave a series of lectures about Hegel in the middle of the century, and I think his interpretation of Hegel's historical mechanics is like at the core of the end of history. It's just that Fukuyama argues that Marxists thought that historical mechanics were moving us in a certain direction, and that was toward Marxism inevitably. And Fukuyama said, at the end of the Cold War, I think it's pretty clear that Marxism isn't the ultimate ideological end state for humanity. It's probably something resembling capitalist liberal democracy, And he's never argued that this process is inexorable. He's always acknowledged that there remain ideological competitors to liberal democracy. His thesis is definitely one of the most misinterpreted and sort of brazenly misinterpreted, maybe in history. He never said things are going to stop happening, wars and recessions and plagues and everything else. But I do think that his core point that liberal democracy has just proven to be the most resilient system is still very much like in play. And I certainly don't think it's been disproven. I mean, people will say, oh, Freedom House just came out with its latest Democracy in the World report, and look, we're seeing this democratic recession, as if that's the knockdown argument, or they'll say Trump, as if that's the knockdown argument against Fukuyama. But he's been dealing with these arguments for the better part of 35 years at this point, And I think his thesis is still strong. So yeah, I'm definitely kind of a Fukuyamian. The problem is that liberalism can accommodate some pretty illiberal ideas. Like, I mean, you can the if Donald Trump comes to power in 2025, he will have come to power democratically. He has genuine support among Americans, and his support has certainly risen since Biden's disastrous debate performance. And he has explicitly stated that he wants to overturn many of the liberal institutions that we have, and he's been explicitly outwardly anti-democratic in the past. He tried to overthrow an American election. So that is one risk involved with any liberal democracy, is that you can use the means of liberal democracy to overthrow it. And it's the gravest risk that liberalism faces today. And you can see this phenomenon happening in lots of other places. Obviously, Viktor Orban's Hungary comes to mind. So yeah, it's a pretty frightening time. Although there have been a couple of successes lately. I mean, I think Keir Starmer winning in Britain is a great turnaround. I mean, I remember Corbynism very vividly, and that was a horrible turn for the Labour Party. In France, I'm sure you and I probably have some disagreement on this, but I was definitely relieved to see the hard left and sort of centrists and some reasonable elements of the right come together to defeat a national rally majority.
Do I give off a Le Pen vibe?
No, not at all. I just wonder if you're less sanguine than me about like the hard left gaining more power in France. That's all.
I don't know. I mean, I trust your opinion more than mine on this issue, to be honest. But
you do not give off Le Pen vibes, for the record.
Good. It looks like Le Pen's party has changed, from what it used to be, and I don't know, I was talking to some friends who live in France. One of them is a Jewish guy who lives in Paris, and I thought he might have voted for her. He didn't. He voted for Macron. But
one of like 10
I don't
people.
know. I thought that. Pardon? One of 10 people. Yeah. Yeah. I may have voted for her. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Giuseppe.
One thing you have to acknowledge about the phenomenon of national rallies. I mean, it went from being what was pretty much an explicitly fascist sympathizing party to something that is much more mainstream. And it was mainstreamed because it wants to be a major player in a major liberal democracy. So on some level, it's frightening to me to see a party with that history able to sort of like polish up its image and to gain prominence. And you're always suspicious. You're always wondering, because Le Pen had to drop the idea of Frexit, for example. And you're always like, does she actually want that, though? Is that something she'd push for if she actually made it into power? But these accommodations that they've made are just sort of a testament to the power of the system that they're trying to operate in. I mean, I do think that they recognize they just simply cannot gain and hold support unless they moderate. So I don't know. It's really just evidence that liberal democracy is strong yet again.
Where does immigration fit into liberal democracies? Like, for example, Germany, I believe, has introduced a law that all new migrants must, at least on paper, I suppose, acknowledge that Israel has a right to exist. Seems pretty easy to cheat that system. Like, what are they going to do? Put you under a lie detector test or something, But what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is obviously one of the biggest sources of political instability in liberal democracies is immigration. And I'm American, although I live in Switzerland now. And you just have to look at the rise of Trumpism and the fact that I'm pretty sure the most recent Gallup polling suggests that the primary issue is immigration. I mean, inflation is up there, the economy is up there, but that's more diffuse. But people are really upset about this. And if you look at Biden's most recent immigration policy, it's much, much more restrictive than anything a Democrat has done without a corresponding negotiation from the Republicans in a very long time. Like, there was no agreement that there'd be path to citizenship. It was just this claim that, like, it's much easier to turn people away for asylum claims and all these other elements that the right has been pushing for anyway. And Biden just kind of preemptively offered all that stuff because he recognizes that the political winds have shifted pretty hard against not unrestricted immigration, because we've never really had unrestricted immigration, but less restricted immigration. And yeah, I mean, you can certainly argue that it was a driving force in the Brexit vote and lots of other political upheavals in Europe and the United States. So, I
Haven't you
just think
had
it's
unrestricted migration across the border
no.
from Mexico? No?
No. That's what I was saying. I didn't mean to imply that we've ever had unrestricted migration, because it's a very heavily fortified border. And it's just, but the United States has
That's not
like
what Twitter would have me thinking. I thought that people were just like walking over there all the time.
Yeah. If you follow like Elon Musk, then that's probably the impression you get. Yeah, no, it's obviously a lot of people do get in, and what they often do is get in, semi-legally, and then end up overstaying visa limitations and things like that. I think the United States has something like 13 million undocumented immigrants, and so that's why the central compromise has always been, the Democrats get a path to citizenship for the vast majority of those people, barring violent felons and some other subcategories. And then Republicans get really strong border security, which I'm 100% in favor of. I have absolutely no problem with the strongest border you can possibly imagine. Like, of course, a country has to have the right to determine who is coming in and who isn't. I mean, most liberals will acknowledge the benefits of diversity. They'll acknowledge like just the fact that, look at the number of CEOs in the United States who are of Indian descent or are just immigrants, and like they're very enterprising. And there's some misinterpretations about the effect of even undocumented immigration on the economy, because these people still spend money in stores. They pay sales tax and other forms of taxes, and they do a lot of extremely difficult work. And I remember Douglas Murray once arguing that was like a racist argument, saying that they do jobs that other people wouldn't do. It's not that other people wouldn't do them. It's just that there are so many people who are doing things like caring for the elderly, everything from caring for the elderly to, hot tar roofing, that are just like not terribly attractive for a lot of other people. And they're also essential for a society to keep functioning. So yeah, this is just, I suppose this is my inner liberal, like recognizing the benefits of immigration while obviously acknowledging the political costs and risks. I just think that's a balance that you have to strike in any democracy.
Yeah, where would you draw lines? For example, do you think what Germany's done in making new migrants acknowledge, that they adhere to certain ideological beliefs, is that fair?
Yeah, there's something about that strikes me as odd. I mean, that seems like such a low bar to clear, saying that the existence of Israel is acceptable. It seems like a low bar. I suppose I don't have a problem with that. I mean, you certainly have to have assimilation to a certain extent if you want immigration to function in your society. You don't want to have. I mean, this is a problem that France faces much more so than the United States when it comes to their Muslim population. It's a very large proportion of France. I mean, I think it's something like 8 or 9%. And then there are these parallel communities that have values that are in many cases sort of antithetical to traditional French values. And in the United States, like American Muslims are more integrated, they're more assimilated, and this is just less of a problem. But it's a good test case, because you can see that in France, it's this endless source of political instability. And in the United States, it's demagogued. It's an issue that xenophobic politicians like Trump can take and frighten people with. And sometimes you have these like ridiculous bills in Oklahoma saying like, we will not submit to Sharia law, as if like somebody is pushing for Sharia law seriously in Oklahoma. But yeah, assimilation is important. I mean, I'm living in Switzerland now, and I'm trying desperately to learn German, and like I don't begrudge anybody here for expecting me to, like, I don't begrudge my wife's family for expecting me to learn German. Like it makes perfect sense to me. So I will.
But is that because you're a liberal Westerner? For example, that I've really been thinking about it recently with, I think, was it Marine Le Pen or Maloney? I think it was Maloney who refused to wear a headscarf when she was meeting with, or entering a mosque or something like that, meeting a Muslim leader. And, I thought about times when I visited Muslim countries and I'd want a headscarf, because that's what we're taught to do. You have to respect their culture because it's part of our values, to respect other people's cultures, but maybe other cultures don't care as much about respecting our values.
Oh, I mean, that's definitely true. Yeah, I don't have a problem with but that is the thing about liberal values and liberal societies. I feel like they can sort of they can absorb hypocrisy like that. Like they can. I mean, this is always the core risk, is that you're pluralist to an extent that you have people who come into your country and live in your country and actually don't. They came for this reason because they have more freedoms to adhere to their cradle faith, or they have the freedom to believe what they want and still live in an affluent, prosperous, democratic country. Um, but you just have to draw certain lines. I mean, I wrote this article about this really horrible episode. It's something called the Batley Grammar School in the UK, where this teacher had taught a lesson about free speech and British values and Islam, and he was essentially run out of town. Like, this campaign was started against him. There were threats to his life, threats to his family. And it was just the exact same thing that happened to Samuel Paty in France, who was ultimately beheaded in front of his school. And it's just like, you see this sort of thing happening, and you just say, well, obviously, any liberal society, in the case of the Batley Grammar School, absolutely can't allow this to happen. And there was something called the Kahn Report for Social Cohesion in Britain, which found that this teacher was failed by pretty much everybody at every level. I mean, the local member of parliament just kind of didn't want to get involved. The police really didn't take action, said he hadn't been the victim of any crime. And this is a guy who's still in hiding and is afraid for his life. And any liberal should see that and say, well, this is just absolutely horrifying and beyond the pale, And then a lot of the groups that agitated against him were doing so with the language of racism and bigotry and intolerance, and they were saying that he was anti-Muslim and he was a white supremacist and all this stuff. And it's just like, this is so cynical, and it's so obviously instrumentalizing the values of liberal society to harm liberal society. So yeah, in all of these cases, I mean, you just have to hold fast to certain principles and ensure that, they're non-negotiable. I mean, free speech for this guy is non-negotiable.
And you do that through law.
Yeah. Oh yeah, certainly.
That's the only, bastion, right?
And civil society. And so, I mean, I wrote an article about it, and you have to push back on it as hard as you can. And anyone who wants more diversity in their societies has to recognize that this sort of episode is the one thing that can make that very, very unlikely in the future, and will lead to the rise of future demagogues and people who want to close the borders, so.
Okay, so liberalism can just bounce back. I hope so. My fear is that, you get such an amount of people who, whether that's through immigration or not necessarily that, but through, other ideologies brewing at home, that people don't want a liberal society, and they, vote in, leaders who do change the law. And I guess that's why you need constitutions and bills of rights and things like that. But, if people don't want liberalism, maybe they've taken it for granted, and, they want to get rid of it. That's how Hitlers and people like that can come to power, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is actually kind of a longstanding obsession of mine. I feel like the citizens of liberal democracies don't know what they have. I mean, I feel like we've entered this decadent age of our politics, where people are constantly trying to overturn the apple cart, and they're really desperately in search of radical ideological solutions to problems that actually don't exist. Or at least, if you look at liberal societies in the context of the broad sweep of human history, the level of prosperity and democracy that we've achieved is really extraordinary. And I just find it strange that people look at modern day Europe, the fact that France and Germany going to war with one another is inconceivable, and they just kind of take that for granted as if that's a historical fact, because France and Germany, as we all know, have had perfectly tranquil relations since the dawn of time. They've never gone to war, but it's just like, how do we not appreciate what we have here? In the United States, There were people like I remember Michael Anton wrote this article called "The Flight 93 Election," where he was saying we have to rush the cockpit or we all die, and that means voting for Trump. And I just thought, like, what planet do you live on? You know, what United States do you live in? I mean, Tucker Carlson, when he was on Fox, every single segment was about just like this wave of crime consuming the country, you know, and every like the endless fear mongering is just so, it just seems ahistorical to me. You know, I mean, the United States certainly has its problems. I mean, it does have a disproportionately high murder rate. It does have a lot of really ugly features, but at the same time, I mean, if you look at how the United States performed in the Cold War, I mean, I think our per capita GDP was never less than 3 times higher than the Soviet Union's. You know, the United States has nearly a $30 trillion economy. Our unemployment rate is hovering around 4%, which is really quite extraordinary. It was under 4% for 2 years straight. This isn't a country that's in decline. This isn't a country that's, you know, on a precipice all the time. But that's what you believe if you watch a lot of American media. So I don't know. It's depressing.
It is. Yeah, and Quillette published a great essay by Martin Boudry on the 7 laws of pessimism. I'm not sure if you read that.
I did,
but yeah, about how we're sort of in many ways wired to be pessimistic, and, you know, I don't know, I haven't been watching as much news as I used to be honest, just because I don't know, I've become one of those people. I used to judge people who said, oh, I don't watch the news. And it's not that I don't watch the news, because I definitely am on Twitter all day and definitely know I'm keeping up to date with what's happening. But, you know, 6 p.m. in Sydney, eating dinner, watching the news, and I'm seeing people get bombed and stuff. I'm like, do I really need this right now after spending most of my day, you know, reading about these issues? I don't think I need to know anymore.
Yeah, I definitely don't have cable news. I mean, I just read online, and I do listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to the Daily, the New York Times podcast, and I listen to the Journal, the Wall Street Journal. But yeah, I get it. I mean, it's depressing. It's especially depressing when I was reading a Times article about voters who had watched the debate, you know, and there was a picture of these 2 girls, and I think they were asking people questions at a 4th of July party, you know, so they're like decked out in their America stuff, and they were about to vote for the first time, and they were both 18 years old, and they just kind of said, like, they said a few sort of conventional things about how they think there should be a younger candidate, and, you know, weren't really impressed with the debate. I remember thinking, like, what if I was 18 and this was the very first presidential debate I ever watched? I mean, I would, all the things that I just mentioned about, you know, the United States GDP, or the fact that people around the world are clamoring to get here, or, you know, the strength of our Constitution, or the fact that we live under the great roof of the First Amendment, you know, that stuff all kind of gets rolled into this one moment for them. You know, for them, this is the president of the United States. This is the debate that everyone keeps telling them this is the most important election of their lives. And you see Trump up there just fulminating, spewing bullshit. And you see Biden unable to construct a single coherent sentence. I mean, those girls are probably thinking to themselves, like, I would do a better job than the president of the United States up there. And this is just like, it's so inert. It's just like, it has to take the joy of any joy that there is to be found in politics. But like, it has to take that out and just kind of like trample on it for them. And it's really sad, you know. And like, I mean, my wife is not very political. She's Swiss, but she just, right after the debate, she came walking into my office and she was just like, "So did you see this?" Because I was just seeing clips on Instagram, and she was like, "He can't talk. He just can't talk." And I was like, it's like any Democrat
and
who
it was
doesn't think
also
that we have
like
a serious
a
problem
dick
here
measuring competition.
Yeah.
Like, it was
The golf,
2 men.
the golf bit. It was unbelievable. Where Biden, first he said he had a 6 handicap, and then Trump was like, "That's his biggest lie all night." And then he like increased it to 8. Like a couple seconds later, Biden was like, "It was an 8. I have an 8 handicap." And I was like, "Oh, it's never a good sign, dude." You know, when you're changing on the fly. But yeah, I don't think the United States has ever watched 2 presidential contenders, a former president and a current president, argue about their golf game on national TV. So that was the first.
Yeah, crazy times.
Rough.
Okay, so I really did want to talk about the Israel lobby. Ooh.
Yeah.
What are
Wow.
we going to do about them?
So scary.
Yeah. So, and thank you to the Israel lobby for sponsoring this podcast.
Yeah. Right. My APAC
Definitely
check
not.
is in the mail.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, who tends to get overshadowed by Mearsheimer all the time. I'm not really
Yeah.
sure why. I guess
Maybe
Mearsheimer
lately. Yeah.
does more, like, I don't know,
I think Mearsheimer is
stuff
more
on TV.
like, I'm not sure if Walt has met with Viktor Orban, and like I feel like Mearsheimer is just more offensive, frankly.
Provocative.
So yeah,
Very
yeah,
provocative.
but Walt's actually, I originally started reading Walt forever ago in Foreign Policy magazine, and I reviewed his book, The Hell of Good Intentions, for Quillette several years ago. Yeah, so they're both realists. Realism is a school of thought in international relations, which holds basically that state relationships are essentially dictated by mechanical forces. Like it's all down to the distribution of power in the international system. States are constantly vying to maximize their relative power in their regions, which basically means that we should pursue an amoral foreign policy that just seeks to find the right balance between different states. This is Mearsheimer actually calls this the billiard ball theory of international relations. So it's just these mindless forces smashing up against one another. And all of this theory obviously discounts the role of internal characteristics of states. So individual political cultures, individual histories, the ideologies and personalities of leaders, all of the things that to me make a state behave like it behaves. Are to realists just sort of sideshows. They're irrelevant variables. All that matters is the distribution of power. And I just think that historically this is just kind of an insane view. Just as a brief aside, Hitler would not have attempted to establish a pan-German empire in Europe if he didn't believe in the racial superiority of Germans. If he didn't have this ideology of expansionism and anti-Semitic, murderous, violence. Like his beliefs led him to behave like he did. Like it just seems like the most obvious denial of reality to say that beliefs and ideologies don't dictate behavior on the international stage, especially in one-party states. So to connect all of that to the Israel lobby, here's a problem. Another problem with their thesis. It's supposed to be descriptive. And in the case of the United States relationship with Israel, they believe that we had fairly good strategic reasons for supporting Israel during the Cold War, because Israel resisted these Arab dictatorships that were supported by the Soviet Union, and it kept winning wars against these dictatorships. And it was very frustrating for the Soviet Union because it had to keep dumping resources into its undersupplied partners in the region. And even Henry Kissinger at the time, who's like kind of this arch realist practitioner, thought that the relationship with Israel was probably worth it. It was giving the United States more than it was taking from the United States. And Mearsheimer and Walt believe that after the Cold War ended, the strategic rationale for the relationship ended as well. But support for Israel has not ended. I mean, the United States it's always ranks at the very top of the list of countries receiving military aid from the U.S., and Americans remain very committed to Israeli security. And so this kind of flies in the face of realist logic. So they had to come up with a theory as to why this was happening. And their theory is that the Israel lobby in the United States, which is comprised of organizations like AIPAC, has just sort of pulled the wool over American voters and citizens' eyes. And
Gentiles. Ooh.
Yeah. So they've convinced us that that Israel deserves support when it does not, in fact, deserve support. And then they run through the strategic reasons why it doesn't, the moral reasons why it doesn't. So that's the basic thrust of their argument. And I read an essay for Quillette pointing out that there are some very fundamental flaws with that argument. The main one is that Americans just genuinely support Israel for pretty good reasons.
Yeah, that we have similar shared values, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's my central argument. And so to unpack that just a little bit, I think the fundamental flaw in their original essay, which is in the London Review of Books, which is just titled "The Israel Lobby," ominously, and then their book, "The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy." What they don't explain is how the support for Israel arose in the first place. And they spend like a couple of pages on this at one point. Like in 1963, John F. Kennedy tells Golda Meir that the relationship between the United States and Israel is really special. It's like the relationship between the United States and Britain. In short order, the United States is providing Israel with arms during the Kennedy administration, and then this really takes off in 1967 after the Six-Day War, and then the War of Attrition and the Yom Kippur War. So, after these conflicts, the United States is suddenly like dumping money into Israel because we can see the strategic benefit. But why did the United States originally do all of this? I mean, this is the AIPAC was just like a small organization with a few $100,000 budget back then. Obviously, they weren't just dictating terms, but Walt and Mearsheimer just kind of gloss over that inconvenient fact for their thesis. And then they talk about how AIPAC became more powerful. And now it's true that AIPAC is one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington. I mean, they definitely receive a lot of support, but I just think that's because Americans have supported Israel for so long. So sorry, that was kind
from
of
their no, go for it. So from their realist perspective, who do they think we should have a better relationship with in that region?
I think they just think that we should. They'll often say we're pro-Israel because we are opposed to the destruction of the state of Israel, which is a pretty low bar to clear. But they're opposed to the destruction of any state in the region. Like they think that a balance of power should be retained. So they recommend something they call offshore balancing, which means the United States will basically come to Israel's aid if it's ever like really outgunned, but then that will restore the balance of power, and then the United States can float back and leave it. But the problem with that is like they'll say, yeah, we should intervene when Israel's existence is threatened. Well, what does that mean exactly? So, I mean, did a million Israelis just die in an Iranian nuclear attack? Assuming that Iran gets a nuclear weapon in the future, and then America can come to Israel. What kind of ally would we be if we said we'll only come to your aid if your existence is threatened? So that's.
I don't fully understand this concept of balancing of powers. Like for them, what is a good balance of powers? I guess it depends on.
Well, this is another.
Country.
Yeah, this is another example of why realist logic can be quite sinister, actually. So one example that I know Walt has cited, and he cited in his book, The Hell of Good Intentions, was the United States support for Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, which is pretty remarkable because that meant we were supporting Iraq at a time when it was waging a pointless attrition war with Iran, which left about 1 million people dead. This was a time when Iraq committed genocide against the Kurds. This is when Saddam Hussein was committing his worst crimes, really. And Walt seems to think that supporting Iraq during that war was a perfect example of realist logic, because you didn't want Iran to become the regional heavyweight. You didn't want them to become what's called the regional hegemon. So support Iraq, keep them balanced. But that's like, to me, that's like a hideous prescription. I mean, basically what you're saying is we're going to perpetuate this pointless attrition war that's killing hundreds of thousands of people, and we're going to support a dictator who is a monster, a genocidal dictator at that. And then we're also ensuring that the Iranians hate us even more than they already did. So it's just, that's an example of balance of power logic, and it's also an example of realist amorality or immorality.
So how does that follow on to Ukraine, Russia?
So in the realist paradigm, like Russia has much more to lose than the United States. So Russia's going to fight to the last. That's basically their argument. And that's a perfectly defensible argument. I get that. So they're basically saying, no matter how much money we funnel into Ukraine, which is, I think it's over 100 billion, which has actually been allocated militarily. And then I think 170 some billion just from the United States, just in overall aid for the war. That's a huge amount of money. It's more than Russia's defense budget. But Russia is notoriously scrappy, and they're in it for the long haul, clearly. And the basic argument is like we need to pressure the Ukrainians to get to the negotiating table immediately and just like cede the territory that's already been taken and just end this as quickly as possible. Like a realist logic wouldn't dictate that we should support Ukraine for any principled reason, like defending their democracy from a bloodthirsty imperialist dictator. They just think that what we have to do is balance power to the extent possible, and that would mean like maybe retaining some neutrality for Ukraine, but giving Russia most of what it wants and preventing the risk of nuclear war. And
realists don't believe that we have any allies or enemies.
Yeah, not really. I mean, that's actually a good way to put it. Like they just don't. We have allies, but they're contingent and short term. Not necessarily short term, but certainly contingent. Like our alliances should only serve us to the extent like we shouldn't. This is why Israel violates their paradigm. I mean, they think that Israel is a strategic liability. So supporting Israel to them is like. But this is another problem I have with realism. Is just it seems to me like if you're going to develop a theory that's descriptive as well as prescriptive, it needs to actually describe how the world works. And clearly, in the case of Israel, realism is not working. And clearly, in the case of liberal hegemony, which is the other big thing that they hate so much, like the war in Iraq was not a realist war. Other things the United States has done for 30 years since the end of the Cold War are they violate realist assumptions about state behavior all the time. So, to what extent is your theory just flawed?
Did they term or did they coin the term Israel lobby? The Israel lobby?
I don't think so, but
Hmm.
they certainly brought it into the mainstream, unlike anyone before them. Because that book was kind of a phenomenon when it came out in like 2007.
Yeah, and he's got such a cult following, Mearsheimer. My God.
Yeah, yeah, he's a huge name all of a sudden. It's interesting because I just think I mean if you look back at his work in the early '90s, he wrote this article for the Atlantic called "Why We Will Soon Miss the Cold War," and it predicts that Germany will likely seek nuclear weapons, that NATO will disband in Europe, that Germany will start bullying and potentially invading its neighbors, that Russia might have to serve as a check on German imperial ambitions. Like these were predictions he was making in the early '90s. It's like you were exactly wrong about literally everything. So maybe we shouldn't maybe we shouldn't be so impressed with your theory, you know. But anyway,
And he was
it's a
wrong
book.
about Russia, Ukraine, right? He said that, Russia would be doing far better than what they're currently doing now, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, he was. I mean, because initially I think he thought Ukraine would just get rolled. But yeah, now he constantly claims vindication. I mean, when Mearsheimer talks about Ukraine, it's like thinly disguised glee that they've experienced setbacks on the battlefield. I mean, he just talks about how Russia's production of artillery and ammunition is so high, and how we don't have the logistical resources necessary to equip Ukraine properly. And he's like, they're in a really bad position. And he kind of says it in this way. It's like, oh, it's almost over. I'm almost vindicated.
Well, he says that about Israel too. Yeah, that Israel's in a really bad state, and it's in serious trouble, and yeah, I guess he just wants to be vindicated.
I think that was his theory or the theme of his talk at CIS in Australia.
Yes.
But I mean,
Mm.
I watched that entire talk, and I actually detected
Good for
some
you.
really
You've got patience.
yeah. Well, it's my job. I mean, I had to read the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy cover to cover. But I noticed that during that talk, Mearsheimer kind of contradicted himself because he was talking about how the Israeli lobby still has this stranglehold on American public opinion, and then he said one of the biggest threats that Israel faces today is the fact that American public opinion has really shifted against Israel. And if you look at young Americans, they're very pro-Palestine, much more so than any preceding generation. And I was just like, oh, so I guess the Israel lobby is not working in this case, or it's just he just doesn't even address this like glaring contradiction in the thesis, but then he barrels on.
Mm. What else are you reading at the moment?
Oh, what am I reading? I'm reading Stalin by Stephen Kotkin, which
Oh,
is
okay.
which is a doozy. And I'm also reading Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, which is really horrifying. I had actually read Snyder's book on tyranny a while ago, and it was just like so short. I think he expanded like a series of Facebook posts into that. So I was kind of like, oh yeah, I guess I can see why people like Snyder so much. But now that I'm reading Bloodlands, I'm like, okay, I can totally see why people like him. So I mean, it's just there's something really extraordinary about reading about a single German prisoner of war camp where they would cram 30,000 or 40,000 Soviet soldiers and other captives into just like a space in the middle of a field, just like a fenced in space with nothing, like no latrines, no food, no water, no nothing. And they would just die in very short order, I mean, oftentimes like a matter of weeks. And I was like, this is like a Gaza level crime and catastrophe, like over 30,000, 40,000 people just in this, just one fell swoop, all dead, move on to the next. Like the numbers in the book are just absolutely staggering because he talks about, I mean, it's basically about like being caught in between the two empires, the German Empire and the Russian Stalinist Empire. Was like the absolute worst place you could possibly be. You get occupied by one nightmare power and then occupied by another. And
yeah, well, I was reading about Baba Yar recently, and the genocide that happened in Ukraine of Jews, and mostly Jews. And I was reading it before bed and I had to stop. It was too gross. But just the amount of people that they could exterminate in a short amount of time was incredible, and like nothing we've seen in a while, and hopefully we never see again. I don't know, maybe it has happened. I know things are happening in Sudan and stuff, I'm not sure, but just the efficiency at just snuffing out life, it was crazy.
yeah, it's just one of those. I mean, you grow up reading books like Night by Elie Wiesel, and you see, I remember in 10th grade was the first time I saw Holocaust footage. Like you go through all of that stuff and it leaves a mark. I mean, certainly you remember it, but to go back and read, because it's been a while since I've read a book just about the final solution and about like just the human toll of World War II. And it's just like, there's something about it that's really numbing. I mean, to even the things that were happening during the terror famine under Stalin, like the sheer numbers, or the Kulak operation, which killed hundreds of thousands of people for absolutely no reason, because this was really like, there was a fear that Japan would invade from the east, and then there would be all of these like sympathizers, and those were the Kulaks in Stalin's mind. So the NKVD just went around and just massacred these people. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people. And then Japan just didn't do that. Like it ended up like aiming its sights southward. And it was just like, okay, well, that was a total waste. Oops, kind of screwed that up. Just killed 500,000 people, but on to the next. And it's just, I don't know. It's numbing. It's very hard to process.
Are you optimistic that we won't see anything like that again, like World War II?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say for the most part, I am. I'm more frightened now than I've ever been. I mean, if you just like, one of the scariest realizations that anyone can come to is that like the process of World War II starting was long. I mean, it wasn't just, oh, hey, here's the invasion of Poland. Now we're underway. That didn't just come out of the blue. There was a lot that led up to it, from the Spanish Civil War to Japan's regional aggression to all of these other factors. So it's like kind of hard to backdate when that war really started, because there were elements of it that were cooking all the time. And if you look at the world today, it's just, there are just kind of some haunting similarities. I mean, things that we haven't seen in a long time. Like, I mean, the threat of China invading Taiwan is like as close as we can get to a modern world war. And like, it seems, if not probable, just so horrifyingly likely within the next few years that I mean, it would just, I think it would be very complacent to just say, oh yeah, it really seems inconceivable. I mean, something like the Holocaust does seem close to inconceivable, but I mean, it was within living memory. So yeah.
It's also harder to conceal, death camps than it used to be, with the technology that we have. And, but we have that technology because we live in free societies where people have access to this technology. It's easy to conceal stuff, in China or North Korea or Russia. So
we have satellites. But we had plenty of technology in the mid 90s, and I think there were American planes circling when the Rwandan genocide happened. Like, I mean, we had there was a push to get like AWACS planes there so that you could disrupt the radio communications between the Hutu militiamen. And the United States didn't even do that. Like, the world just did absolutely nothing while 800,000 people were killed in 90 days, which is, I mean, that's a Holocaust level of efficiency and killing. And I mean, that did just happen. So there is something about Rwanda that's really haunting for that reason. It's like, oh, well, I mean, I was alive. I was 5 years old, and this was happening in the world. So, yep. I guess, unfortunately, we can never say never.
Should we try
That's
to end on a light note?
Yeah, it's a
I
dark
don't
turn.
know what
Dark
light
turn for
notes
the.
we
I'm not
have.
sure. Well,
And
you asked what I
it's
was
getting
reading.
dark here too.
Yeah, I just happen to be reading just sheer horseshow right now. Like, so it's yeah.
Well, what's something to be positive about?
I think probably to get back to where we were at the beginning, I personally think the secularization of the West is a good thing. I'm happy to see it. I don't think the new theism movement would exist, but for this like really huge secular resurgence, which is a good thing. I think if you look at what just happened in France, if you look at the UK, there's some signs that things aren't so horrifying. Poland and Hungary in the European elections, the Orbanist sort of ugly populist right wing forces didn't perform especially well. Um, the United States, I really don't have much good to report. I mean, after Biden's debate performance and this like incessant hand wringing about who the nominee is even going to be, and Trump's poll numbers so high, like it's just really not looking good. Yeah, the United States is unfortunately a very serious outlier. But yeah, go back to the good stuff. Things aren't so
You did
things
the
aren't so rotten
opposite
in
of
Europe.
you did the opposite of a shit sandwich, which is you put shit bread shit.
No wait, no wait. There was in Italy, or not Italy, in India. Modi didn't perform all that well either in the recent elections, so
Okay.
that's also a good sign. Hey, okay, we should probably
Great.
just pack it in before I
Okay,
say
well,
something horrible.
thank you. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Yeah.
And yeah, catch you on Twitter soon. Hopefully you write something for us again soon as well.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They'll just keep coming.
Great.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks,
see you
Zoe.
later.
Yeah. Bye.